All right, I think we'll get started. I'm Dee Dee Ruggles. I'm the director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory, and I'm really glad to see you all this evening to hear our former colleague, Dave Roediger. I actually think this is a really interesting audience. It couldn't be softer in that it's packed with friends. So if you expect criticism, it's not coming. Let's begin by acknowledging that while we are here at UIUC, we are also on the historic lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations, lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. As a land grant institution, in your book you call it a land grab institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the multiple histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. The Unit for Criticism joins with other programs at UIUC in seeking to illuminate and analyze that history and in seeking to create a vibrant, inclusive community here on campus. Well, the Unit for Criticism was founded in 1982 with the mission of investigating the conditions and limits of knowledge, the structures of power and authority, and the ways societies relate past, present, and future, doing so within the frame of the humanities and humanistic social sciences. The first such center for theory to be established in the US, the unit has tackled the issues of difference, diversity, equity, and inclusion in its many conferences and lecture series since its foundation. And we have every intention of continuing to do that in the future. And we're also not going to call it something else. Right? Okay, yeah. Now, some of you may have attended the recent unit conference, Protest in the Post-Political Era, a timely and urgent conversation about the need for and strategies of protest in the current moment. And we are already hard at work at planning the Modern Critical Theory lecture series that occurs on Tuesday evenings in the fall semester, as well as lectures, a symposium, reading groups, and book manuscript reading workshops for the spring semester. And as always, I welcome your suggestions for speakers and topics. In fact, many of our speakers and topics have come from you, the constituents of the unit. And then if you want to know about future events, of course, check the unit website. Before I proceed to introduce our speaker, I've also been asked by Brett Kaplan to just announce this event happening tomorrow. In fact, Tai Wakabayashi, who designed the beautiful poster and who does so much work along with Jamie Keener. Where are you guys? Where's Tai? Tai back there, Jamie up front, do so much work for the unit, really kind of like a graduate student advisory board. He's speaking, and it's tomorrow in the Levis Faculty Center, starting at what time, Brett?
9 a.m. to 5 p.m.
9 to 5, okay. And I'll put this actually right here in case afterwards you want to consult that. All right, with that, I was happy to introduce our speaker and to welcome Dave Roediger back to UIUC campus. Dave is very much an Illinois product, as one realizes reading his, is this a memoir? Are you calling it a memoir? Because it's also a kind of social history.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Whatever that thing is over there. And we'll talk more about that in a minute, too. Born in Columbia, Illinois, he was educated at Northern Illinois University and continued on from there to Northwestern for his PhD in history. He began his trajectory as a teacher, as an assistant professor at Northwestern, then Missouri, Minnesota, and then 14 years here at UIUC, for which we are all very grateful, before leaving for Kansas, where he is the Foundation Distinguished Professor of American Studies and History. In 1989, he co-authored Our Own Time, A History of American Labor and the Working Day, a book that documented the movement to shorten the working day in the United States. And from that study of labor, he then examined the role of race and labor, and especially whiteness as an emerging identity. He showed that white laborers, instead of bonding with black labor in common cause, sought to distinguish themselves from black labor and thus to achieve some imagined commonality with their white bosses. That work, published in 1991, was The Wages of Whiteness. And it was a key work that, together with Noel Ignatins, I've never known how to pronounce that name. Yeah.
He changed his name, so.
Okay. How the Irish Became White. These two books are credited widely with launching the field of whiteness studies. And I have this written down here, but of course I just finished reading the book this afternoon, and I realized that whiteness studies is actually a term that you kind of shy from because it makes it sound like it's a standalone branch of theory as opposed to something that is born from and, you know, sort of eternally connected to the field of critical race theory and black studies. His list of publications is long and reveals a career dedicated to the exploration of race, class, and labor, Marxist history, Marxist theory, and radicalism. His most recent book, An Ordinary White, My Anti-Racist Education, tells the story of the changing political environment of the Midwest from the perspective of a kid and young adult growing up in Illinois' sundown towns, surrounded by the casual, ordinary, these are your terms, racism of his white, lower middle class, Catholic, but also Lutheran community. And he writes about how his involvement with social movements and participation in the SDS and the Black freedom struggle led to political awareness. This was a conversion in which, and now I'm quoting from the book, public education, dissenting currents in Catholicism, knowledge of the importance of good union jobs, and generative impulses in sports and music helped make his salvation stick. Come on in, you're welcome. In other words, although affected by hugely important social and political issues, this is at its heart a very human story. I think that's its power. The book is half memoir and half social history. Released just last month, it's a personal account of a history lived in a particular time and place that offers a response to recent attacks on critical race theory. So Dave will talk to us about the book, and he's very generously brought copies with him, which he will sign after his talk. And Brian, will you just explain how that's going to work? Do you want this, or you want to shout?
Just quickly, I'm Brian Dolliner from EJP with my colleague Chad Wren. Dave has generously donated copies of the book, and donations for the book are going towards Education Justice Project. And specifically, we're raising money now for a deportation guide called A New Path. Before Trump was elected, we were getting requests for our deportation guide a handful a month. Since the election, we've gotten 4,000 requests for the book. People, as will happen in the prison system, people will do a 15-year prison sentence and then be deported after that term. So this is a book to try to help them with the transition and help families prepare. So thanks to Dave for the donations. We'll be collecting donations after. Good. Anything else, Chad?
And signing, book signing too. Book
No.
signing.
Feel free to talk to us after if you have any questions about our work.
All right, with that, I'll turn the microphone over to you, Dave. Where do you want this one? That one? Okay, here. Yeah. Wherever you want. That glasses in there.
Any other person, Sabi? Free.
Good to go. All right, great. Did we clap? No, it's
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming. And just to be clear about the books, this is not a way to hijack you into buying a book. If you, and particularly if there are graduate students or undergraduate unwaged people, just take a book for free, or you can give a little bit of money, but get in the habit of donating to EJP. So thanks, Professor Ruggles, and thanks, Ty. I didn't know, Ty, that you had done that poster, which is wonderful. Thanks. And to Jamie Keener at the unit, and to Brian Dolliner and Chad for handling the book sales, and to Gio for the tech help. I also need to thank University of Cairo in a roundabout way. When Stephen didn't get a job here, Saleda, Robert Warrior and I, there were little nibbles at a boycott, but we just decided among ourselves that for our own sanity we needed to not come back to Illinois until Stephen gets a job. And we both thought, well, that means forever, because the blacklist seemed to be so total. But Stephen got a job at University of Cairo, so here I am. I want to confess something at the beginning, and that is that I don't quite know how to speak to this moment in history. This is the fourth of, I think, 15 book talks that I'm giving, and the first three, there's enough like, will the slides work, and how long am I going to talk, and there's kind of things to engage your attention beyond whether you understand what you're doing yourself. And this time was the first time, I think, because I knew how many friends and how many, I hope, critics would be here, that I don't think any of us know how to speak to what George Lipsitz, my friend, calls this moment of danger in the U.S. And it's particularly hard with a memoir or something like a memoir, because the temptation is to be a little bit light and easy and show that I'm not taking myself too seriously. But then that comes off as itself normalizing of this moment. So that's by way of saying, don't ask me at the end, we'll have question and answer, don't ask me what we should do. So I don't even know how to give a talk. So, but it is, I think it might be a time to talk about optimism and pessimism. The book at the very end talks about optimism and pessimism a little bit. The image before you is the book that occasions my talk. It is, still shockingly to me, an autobiography, and as such, it consists of a lot of little stories. But it is also a set of arguments, often implicit. The most sweeping of those arguments is that people born into situations of extreme social backwardness do not necessarily have to stay there. The more subtle corollary is that in finding our ways out, however persistent the scars and bad habits, we call upon values and resources actually learned in those retrograde settings. It is centrally an argument about the reality of white advantage, even among disadvantaged whites. There's more, including a long final section on the unsustainability of flagship state universities and higher education more broadly, that seemed impossibly bold a year ago when I finished writing this book, but now has been thoroughly passed up by the horrors of the last 10 months, and reads surprisingly like timidity and common sense now. With one possible, if we have time, exception, I'll not present from that tonight, but we'll say it contains pretty extensive reflections on UIUC as well. So the book, An Ordinary White, was originally titled in my head when I had a little Post-it note on my computer that it was called The Making of a Critical Race Theorist. And my idea was to do that book. It was at that moment that Kansas was making critical race theory impermissible. And I had in mind to do a tour then of only universities in states where it was illegal to do critical race theory. And I ended up not being interested in writing more than 30 pages about critical race theory, so that didn't work out. But it does work out that I'm only speaking in states where critical race theory is impermissible because it's all 50 now that it's on these many lists of forbidden words. So most of the book's 6 chapters are about, it takes me a long time to get even to university life, and so it's about my youth, and my, very little of it is about universities until the very end. My mentor was Sterling Stuckey, and we'll see a slide of him in a minute. And I right before he died, I went out to Riverside where he had ended up teaching, and I interviewed him for 13 hours. And he talked for 10 minutes, I realized, in listening to the tapes, about universities or academics or anything like that. He talked about what he called his career in the civil rights movement. And so this is very much a book of that sort. I'm going to begin then with reading the very first words of the book. In a preface, it's called Becoming Fathomable. They wouldn't let me use fathomable in the title. So I didn't really want ordinary, but Howard Zinn had this great moment in the early 60s where he wrote an article that said, that was titled Our Race is Southern Whites Fathomable. And he argued, and he had as strong a critique of Southern racism as you can imagine, but he argued that it's a mistake to regard any large group of people as unfathomable, because then you can't realize how they can be moved. So the preface is actually called Becoming Fathomable. And the first words are about an adventure I had in the early 90s in St. Louis. In 1993, I began teaching at summer schools on race and class for industrial workers around St. Louis. Socialists organized some of them. The New Directions Reform Caucus of the United Automobile Workers convened others. One was so mainstream that the incoming international president of the Steelworkers Union attended as a student. He was good as a student. Not knowing how to begin, I jotted down a possible question on my way to the event and a follow-up. The question was, why would anybody want to identify as a white worker? And then the follow-up was, why not just as a worker? Two concerns made me hesitate to ask those questions of that first class of UAW members. The first was that whites, and it was about 70% white, 30% in this case African American, the whites would shut down, leaving the question to black students to answer. This happens frequently enough in university classrooms when race comes up. The second worry anticipated that some of the white workers would say that affirmative action and other reforms that addressed race were what forced them to identify as white, that they were being called white, and so they had to defend their interests as white. So I couldn't decide whether to ask them. I took the questions with me. I wadded them up and put them in my pocket. And then I pulled them out and asked them. I opted for those big, hard questions because the workers who came, perhaps 70% white, seemed so familiar to me. I'd grown up about a dozen miles from St. Louis and closer still to the big suburban Chrysler plant outside the city. Lots of my friends had taken industrial jobs right out of high school. The ones in good unions and working overtime were still making considerably more money than I was. I was a professor at University of Missouri then. The ones, I knew such friends to be clever and to have lots to say. I'd just turned 40 and the summer school's average age was right around there. Such familiarity ruled out any supposing that the whites in the class would be without racism. I knew that they and myself, I knew us as people formed by some of the worst ideas and prejudices in U.S. society. But I suspected they were not only that, and I wanted to hear what they had to say in an integrated, union-based setting. Exactly the sort of place that Bill Clinton's pollsters had scrupulously avoided in setting up focus groups in the then recent 1992 presidential election. They famously set up these all-white and originally all-male focus groups in a working class area outside Detroit in order to elicit complaints about black people and then to be able to run away from black voters. When I posed the question, white workers immediately answered with a catalog of white advantages that anchor a white worker identity. They said, you get better home loans. You have a shot at getting into the skilled trades and making twice as much money. You can live in any neighborhood, the ones with the better schools. The cops don't get after you as much. The workers who were white thus explained how white advantage persisted long after legal equality, much as did those of us who were contributing to the developing, in fact, at that time, brand new field of critical race theory. They knew a lot. Broad conversation across color lines then occurred. From that time on, why be a white worker figured as a question in almost every labor workshop I've taught. In one steelworkers school I taught, a childhood neighbor of mine turned up. He had proven a rank and file leader across the color line in his local union. He didn't learn that in our little aggressively all-white town, I would have once said. But in talking to him after, Fred, this is Jim Turner. Yeah. In talking to him after the class, it became clear that he did learn some of his anti-racism there, every bit as much as I had. So this is a picture of, let me just say one more thing about the passage on the summer school. It also lets me acknowledge how important being in a union family was in my life. My mom was 49 years a school teacher and a union militant in the teachers union. And my dad and my dad's family worked through the years at a limestone quarry that was unionized, and so it's a reminder to suggest that when working class people become college teachers, we ought to search not only for ways we are different from the people who raised us, but also how we are like them. So this is the first of several slides on kind of how I learned racism and the settings where I learned it. This first one is the town where I was born, which is East St. Louis, Illinois. And I say where I was born, not my hometown. I've always been tempted to claim that I was an East St. Louisan because it's been such a great place in so many ways through the years. It's the place of Miles Davis and Tina Turner and Katherine Dunham and Eugene Redmond and Henry Dumas, and you could go on and on. But I wasn't actually anything but born there. I lived 10 miles to the south, and the hospital in which I was born, my birth certificate says East St. Louis. But this is a picture of the Armour meatpacking plant in East St. Louis, which closed in 1959 and became part of the abandoning of East St. Louis by Capitol and by the government as well. This picture is from the 20-teens, so that Armour plant stood there for a further 65 years, and they never bothered to take it down, never cleaned up their mess. My former colleague here, Orville Burton, who many of you will fondly remember, did some mapping of East St. Louis, which showed that the city is one that not only leads the nation in percentage of toxic waste sites, but also that those waste sites are in floodplains. And so when people say, why doesn't East St. Louis redevelop? It's actually kind of obvious that this kind of corporate abandonment, but not actually just also leaving behind everything that was there, makes it what another former Illinois professor whom I taught with, Jennifer Hamer, has described as an abandoned city by the 1970s. I want to tell, so these ruins of East St. Louis coexisted in my consciousness with adults in both sides of my family who would talk about the decay of black homes in East St. Louis and people not keeping up their property. And so they could drive past these massive abandoned plants. And then what would occasion comment was that homeowners didn't keep up their property. The one really vivid memory of learning race via East St. Louis that I had was we would go to the big Sears store on the south end of East St. Louis, which is in the black, even then before it became an all-black city, was in the black community. And we would get in the car in Columbia, drive 10 miles up the river road, and then get to with the windows down, July, 95 degrees, 95 humidity, we'd get to the first stop sign in Blackie, St. Louis, and all the adults would very ritualistically roll up all the car windows and lock the doors. So what was an impossibly hot ride to begin with became now absolutely airless. But the lesson was that here lies danger. And the one really good film I think about whiteness, it's a hard thing, it's been a hard thing for filmmakers to, at least documentary filmmakers, to penetrate. But the one really good film is by a filmmaker named Amy Sands in Boston. And that starts with about 5 or 6 minutes on exactly that scene in her life, 1,000 miles away from where I grew up. So this is a map of historic sundown towns and probable sundown towns in the United States. And it's the work of Jim Lowen, who many of you will know and remember from, he's from Decatur, but he did a lot of his field work based at what's the name of the kind of hippie dorm?
Allen Hall.
Allen Hall, yeah. Sorry, probably not anymore. Okay, good. So Jim would stay there and go out and do field work. And through Tougaloo College, they generated this map that summarizes some of his research. Illinois led the nation in sundown towns with almost half, again, as many as its nearest rivals, Indiana and Wisconsin. 2/3 of all Wisconsin counties were and often are have a county seat that's a sundown town. Some sundown towns, especially on railroads, had a 6 p.m. whistle to remind about enforcement of their policy. I grew up in a sundown town. It was on a railroad, and it had such a 6 o'clock whistle, although I was unclear about it until Jim educated me and then made me go ask my mother about it. And she said, oh, yeah, definitely, that's what that was about. The town is Columbia, Illinois, which sits on the southwest edge of that very red area that looks kind of like a beet, maybe. There's Columbia and a host of other sundown towns. So close to St. Louis and East St. Louis, we grew up in in a total absence of black people. We worshiped the style and excellence of the great black and Latinx stars of the St. Louis Cardinals of the 1960s. We plotted to get underage into clubs to see East St. Louis black entertainers. The sundown town slide also offers a chance to think again about white advantage. My granddad on my father's side, I said people worked in a quarry, had a good union job in a quarry as a machinist. The census called him a repairer in the quarry outside town. He supported a family of 9 in a modest house he owned and also had an orchard and a large yard leading into woods with wild game, morel mushrooms, and berries. He and his sons were always possessed of good hunting and fishing gear. He also was able to accumulate impressive tools, and with his 2 sons built the house I grew up in. With every town in the county a sundown town, those relatively good, though dangerous, quarry jobs went to whites. Some sundown towns were actually cities. The Steel Center, Granite City, near where I grew up, and LaSalle, Peru, near here, for example. And their housing segregation, we see sundown towns and we say, oh, this is housing segregation, this is residential, or we say this is police brutality, which it often was to enforce the sundown provisions. But it was also employment discrimination, because it meant that you really couldn't conveniently get jobs near the plants in those periods. Columbia now has 11,000 people and 3 African Americans. So it's just persisted in that exact pattern. This exquisite and awful 1962 photograph introduces the other place in which I grew up. It is by the celebrated photographer and filmmaker Danny Lyon, who is, I always expect college audiences to be 19 years old, so sorry. But it is, it was made when Lyon was about college age, traveled 1,000 miles as a 20-year-old New Yorker to photograph the Black Freedom Movement in Cairo, Illinois. And so we've had Cairo and now Cairo, And sometimes at the southern tip of Illinois, people say Cairo, but not Cairo, definitely. Carrie's here, right? The great historian of Cairo is in the back, Carrie Pimblott. The small city where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers meet. Lyon met at the demonstrations in Cairo, almost as young, 22-year-old black organizer John Lewis, who was almost killed in the pool protest, and yes, the late John Lewis, the good trouble John Lewis, and it was John Lewis who convinced Danny Lyon to become a filmmaker and a photographer. Because my mother came from Cairo and she was then a single parent, I spent summers there. And in the book then I try to describe this protest. Cairo had a swimming pool from the 1930s, public swimming pool, till 1962. And it was built with New Deal money, but it was always all white and Jim Crow swimming pool. And so these young people from a variety of civil rights groups are trying to integrate this pool. And the city's response is to just give up the pool. And they people say Atlanta was too busy to hate. Cairo, I think, was too hateful to really get very busy about civic improvement. But I lived there then, I was 10 in 1962, and I got to live there through the next 10 years, more on this later, at least part of the time, and see this freedom movement develop. And also on the other side, see the armed whites, one of whom called himself my uncle, who was the mayor of the town, and to see them brandishing guns at home to brag about how ready they were for firing on the black community and for resisting civil rights. The other thing I want to say, I'm not going to read the passage, but my mom had a very interesting reaction when we talked about this later. She died 2 years ago at 100. And she had an interesting reaction. I said, what do you remember thinking when the pool closed? And she said, I thought that now the kids will start drowning again. And, two rivers, the backwaters to the two rivers, no way to learn to swim, the hottest summers imaginable, very low-lying, pestilential area. And so kids would naturally go into one or the other of the rivers. And her point was that then they'll drown, they'll start drowning again. It's really a class-conscious statement, too, because it reflected the fact that there was a country club for the elite whites, the people who would come by our house and show off their guns. They were provided with swimming lessons and swimming. But what she couldn't get, and she really transformed herself around questions of race in her lifetime, what she couldn't get was to stop to say, and that was always the case for the black community in Cairo. That there was never any period when there was a pool and swimming lessons that were available to them, or that their kids weren't tempted to go into the rivers and to swim. So here's another image that speaks to the coexistence of white advantaged and disadvantaged whites. It pictures my mother as an infant and her dad, whom I never even came close to meeting. Within 4 years of the picture being taken, that picture's probably about 1923, my mother was an orphan, losing her mom in a calamitous childbirth that twin brothers survived, and her dad, pictured in the photo, in an industrial railway accident. He was a railroad worker, skilled in craft, notorious for its segregationist practices of both employers and unions. His good union job and benefits, protected by color bars, made it possible for my mother and her brothers to be raised together by relatives rather than being put into care. He left behind a house and the beginnings of 2 others that he was trying to buy and finish. Those assets, 1 lived in and 2 sold, made it possible for all 3 kids to attend excellent, again segregated, Catholic schools and to graduate high school. The small black Catholic school is actually run by African missionaries in Cairo, small little St. Columba's school. Meanwhile, canceled class for long periods in the fall and in the spring to force children into agricultural labor, particularly if the kids were on welfare. Their parents were made to take them out of school and to go work in the fields. Cairo being, its countryside being of all things a cotton growing area still in Illinois. My mom managed through contributions of kin and her own wage work to attend, often hungry, the normal school for teachers that became later Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. It was all but all white and heavily subsidized by taxes. It took her a further 25 years to finish her BA, a course at a time, but she was able to teach and become a union leader all through those years based on the fact that you only needed a 2 years of college to teach at that time. So, by all accounts, this is a disadvantaged childhood, a disadvantaged family. And yet it's that little margin of white advantage that kind of provided, I just sold her house, and it's that area is still one of the hottest for poor whites areas. And, almost nobody who's from East St. Louis or from the north side of St. Louis intergenerationally transferred wealth through owning a house in her lifetime. And her, even adjusting for inflation, she made a lot of money off of this modest little working class house that she had. So this is, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about being typical and not being typical, and what it is to get out of a sundown town, both physically and spiritually. I grew up in what might be considered the 2 most racist settings possible, the sundown town Columbia and the southern, albeit in Illinois, city, Cairo, massively resisting civil rights, but mostly in the sundown town. It sometimes seems pretty remarkable that any of us got out of that sundown town, but most did physically, and many also came to reject the idea of living segregated lives. I want to be sure to emphasize this point to be certain that we do not regard my experience as utterly exceptional or unfathomable. Indeed, the book title calls that life ordinary, and the book argues that it is at least fathomable. So I point out, for example, that I grew up in what was called a mixed marriage. At that time, Lutheran and Catholic. I just found out that in Namibia and other parts of Southwest Africa at the time, the German word for miscegenation and the German word for Catholics marrying Lutherans is the same word. And I always had this kind of purchase on social difference through the fact that they couldn't get along in their marriage, and decided to think of it as being about religion. Actually, my own religion. And I grew up in a trade union family. Lots of people grew up in a trade union family. I grew up sometimes in poverty. Lots of people did. I grew up as a Catholic. I was ultimately raised Catholic in post-Vatican II, so with some kind of space for the barrigans and guitar masses and the Catholic worker, and some oppositional Catholic culture. So all of these things were things that were very much widespread experiences, I think. But I had a couple of things, well, one thing in particular that I'm going to talk about today, that made my experience different, and that is that the section of the book is called "Saved by a Shorter Church Service," and it's about my being made to go to Catholic Mass when I was as long as I was in the home of my mother. I had to go to Catholic Church, and I didn't really resist it. I just said, I'm going to find ways to use this to get the car and go to some other town to church. But when I was in Carroll, I was really stuck because the one church, the white church, was a Irish Catholic church where Mass was 95 minutes long. And then I began to realize, I'll just read it. Sunday Mass was an obligation. The ritual seemed tolerable, and I did not resist church going, trying instead to minimize it. In Carroll, only the long ornate morning segregated services at St. Patrick's seemed on offer until I noticed that sometimes my aunt attended St. Columba Mission Church. That small black congregation worshiped just doors from the telephone company where my aunt worked and 6 blocks from my extended family's house. Carroll's not a very segregated place in a firm. So it was in people's heads, but it was not very segregated if you looked at maps. The Black Mission Church, a cooperative venture of the diocese and the African Mission Society, remained worlds apart from St. Patrick's, where I had attended. I walked to the Mission Church more and more, attracted at first mostly by the incredibly short duration of its masses. I was allowed to go there by my family after age 9 or so, and I could just walk there through a black community, but that my family thought of as, oh, you walk this way and therefore you're in a white community. While black parishioners were decidedly unwelcome at St. Patrick's, I attended the black church without incident. That ended in 1963 when the diocese closed both the school and the church at St. Columba. Now, Carrie, if I would have known you were going to be here, I wouldn't have probably been so confident and glib about some of this. When the diocese reopened St. Columba 5 years later, that represented a victory for the civil rights movement, one now interlaced with black power ideas. When the young white priest Gerald Montroy came to Carroll in August of 1968 after an earlier assignment in East St. Louis, it was unclear if the church would reopen or simply use the structure for church-to-community outreach. It ended up being both, with Montroy deciding to offer Mass again in response to all he heard regarding how ill-received black churchgoers were at St. Patrick's. By the time that I returned to services at the Mission Church, its status in my world and in the world had changed from convenient to deeply meaningful. The Black United Front, the central organization of struggle and self-defense against what were now armed attacks on pyramid courts and on the church itself, moved its offices to St. Columba. The arresting graphic of the gun and Bible were on display in the church, and that's what you're seeing. The congregation went from accepting a white presence to being downright friendly, in part because whites, often from out of town, attended to support the United Front. Impressive leaders, including Charles Cone, who's not much older than I was and already a 10-year civil rights veteran, particularly engaged, and Hattie Kendrick and Preston Ewing particularly engaged me. Raised in the segregated projects near where I stayed, Cone played a central role in the swimming pool protests as a high school student, receiving a brutal beating for his heroism. So I'd read in the paper about and hear from my relatives about how terrible these people were, and then I'd see them in these social struggle situations, and it was just impossible to maintain that without a lot of dissonance. I also had the advantage that I somehow got to go to college after my sophomore and my junior years. I went to college on a Cold War program designed to make United Statesians better scientists so they could defeat socialism. And I went to Manchester College in northern Indiana first, which is a pacifist Church of the Brethren school, and I got this extraordinarily good education on the war on Vietnam, and was able to begin to understand race and war from that. And then I went to University of Georgia the following summer, and I got to I joined SDS as a 16-year-old, I guess, in Athens, Georgia, and then I had to come home where there was no SDS, of course. But I joked with people in the New Left later that I was from a place so backward that you had to go to Georgia to get radicalized. So I'm going to show that. I wasn't going to show this today, but I'm going to show it just because Fred's here. There's the masthead of the underground newspaper that we ended up producing in our high school, and Dobb was a part of that. And it was kind of in response to a series of censorships of the student council wanted to give money to do educational programming on the Black United Front and give money to the Black United Front as a donation at holiday time, and I was writing a column in the school paper, and all of a sudden it couldn't be printed because it was taking up issues that couldn't be taken up. So we did this underground paper, and it was so severely repressed in a kind of completely ham-handed way that didn't amount to anything but a lot of noise. And so then we felt like we had to do a second one to show that we didn't believe that we could be stopped. And so there were 2 issues of this. And it kind of made me start to think about repression for the first time, and how these institutions fight back. And I'm going to, the balance of the talk, I'm going to talk just a little bit about the ways that repression works, and it doesn't, and at the same time it doesn't work. So that's me in 1970. And I think it was very important that I went to college in 70 and 71 and was a part of the New Left, but the very tail end of the New Left. And so I didn't have any of I didn't ever believe there was going to be a revolution the day after tomorrow in the way that some people did, and then were very disappointed by. I had some older friends who thought that they were in a beloved community with the Black Freedom Movement, and then that they were kicked out of it. I never had that experience, and kind of and I never expected to have that experience. So I went to Northern Illinois. I was all set to go to Yale, and the tennis coach at Northern persuaded me that he could make a tennis player out of me, and we were poor enough that my dad was dead, and it just, the cost of Yale versus no cost at Northern swayed me. So I get to DeKalb, and it coincided with the tennis coach leaving for Notre Dame. So now I'm there, and I had no idea what I was doing there. And DeKalb's a very, very cold and windy haven for cold Canadian air coming down, particularly to DeKalb. And so I was particularly wondering what I was missing in New Haven, not so much around intellectual life, but around politics, because this was the year, the period of the Black Panther trials in New Haven, and Yale was a kind of a hotbed of, weirdly, of New Left activity. So I started casting about for what I could do at Northern, and it turned out that it was pretty easy to find groups, and that there was actually an SDS chapter, and SDS really kind of ceased to exist in 1970. That's why the dates are important. It imploded, and it imploded after the murders of students at Kent State and Jackson State, and so it was, and SDS didn't really have an answer for that the state was willing to go to that kind of level of repression. And so on the one hand, this was great for me because it meant I was a leader immediately, because everybody else was quitting the movement and I was joining the movement. And but it also looked like a really hopeless thing. It was a committee of Inquisition in Illinois at this period called the Horsley Committee, that was going around from one campus to another to ferret out radicals who had supposedly caused the uprisings of the year before, when there were really significant demonstrations that led up to Kent State and Jackson State. So I went to this Horsley Committee hearing and picketed outside, but then also went inside. And I met people outside, but mostly inside, I heard the names of all these people that were identified as the radical faculty on campus. And so for me, the repression worked in exactly the opposite way. It turned out that, some of you may know this, Northern had this fabulous Marxist history department in those years that they hired first 1 and then 2 and then 5, and Marxist historians who were blacklisted by all the other universities. And when I was there, every other search, this was back when you still got to do searches at universities, every other search was, the non-Marxists didn't even participate. They just let it be one for you and one for us. So I was able to figure out pretty quickly what classes I should take and what kinds of leadership I could do through SDS, and we kept plugging away, and we were supposed to have been defeated in that period. But it turns out that it's hard to defeat a social movement, and it's particularly hard to defeat a social movement over a long period of time. So this is 1972 in the mining of the harbors in Hanoi and Haiphong during the war in Vietnam. And we were able to do in 1972 pretty much what the students had done in 1970 before Kent State and Jackson State. We closed down the roads. We took over the administration building. We did all of those things. The other thing I want to say about Northern, and then I'll just have one more slide, is that I didn't realize it at the time, but this was another instance where I think when white people make real progress in thinking about race, it's almost always because they're around a Black freedom movement. And this was, the timing of my getting to Northern was just after protests that led to the admission of 1,000 Black students in a 2-year period. In 1968, with the assassinations, the Black student population in DeKalb was about 4 dozen. And they were able to so successfully protest that the university promised Black studies. So by the time I got to Northern, there was that an already existing center for Black studies. And they promised these hundreds and ultimately thousands of admissions of working class Black kids from Chicago. And they did it through networks so that the kids almost all knew each other, and were often pretty highly politicized anyway, because it was right after, 6 months before I entered college, Fred Hampton was murdered by the FBI and the Chicago police. So these were students who knew about Fred Hampton and were used to organizing. And I was close to a lot of the basketball players because the tennis and basketball were the same locker room. And it was the only time in history that Northern was actually good in basketball. They were a top 10 basketball player. Billy Harris, the best schoolboy basketball player in Chicago history, was on the Northern's team at that time. So I'd go to all the games, and this is the picture of the Black students at every game, not sitting on the Northern side, not sitting on the away team side, but sitting by themselves and with whoever else wanted to join them. And would never stand for the national anthem, and would then, as soon as the national anthem was over, get up and sing, lift every voice and sing. And the NFL acts like it kind of invented this in the last 4 years or something, but it was something that really, really transformed me. That there was this, still, one of my kids is totally fine with not standing up, and the other is like completely appalled that he's expected to do that politically, but just shyness. So one more, I think, maybe two. I want to just talk about where we learn things a little bit, and how little our learning experiences are on campus. And so as much as I think it's right to despair about the entry of the government into the curriculum, people don't mostly learn things through the curriculum. Anyway, you learn things through struggle and through activism. So this is Sterling Stuckey, who was my mentor at Northwestern. I ended up going to do a PhD at Northwestern in the late 70s. And Sterling was still there, about to leave. And he just, he was the hardest professor I ever had, and also the least concerned with academia and accolades and grades and all of that stuff. He just was relentless in wanting you to know that this stuff was important. And I talked about how when I interviewed him, we just never could get to school. It was all about, I went to the roller rink and I realized that this was a ring shout, and I learned African American culture by being at Southside roller rinks, and he wrote the curriculum for the Mississippi Freedom Schools during Freedom Summer, during and after Freedom Summer with Staunton Land, and he was just this exquisite role model, but not an academic role model. The other person who's up on that screen is Fred Thompson, who was the historian of the IWW, the official historian of the industrial workers of the world. And he was about 80 when I met him. We knew each other for probably 10 years. And he had been given the Charles Kerr Company, the world's oldest radical publisher. People even older than he realized that they were going to die and that there was nobody to take over the company. And so they said, Fred, would you give this a decent burial? And Fred then decided to enlist mostly me and others in the Chicago Surrealist group, mostly to move boxes, I think, more than the boxes of books. He wanted help with that. But he ended up giving us this incredible education. This is a picture of him leaning on a whole bunch of Kerr books, including the first U.S. edition of Capital. That was the kind of the edition of Capital for a long time. And it turned out that we figured a way forward, and we didn't bury the Kerr Company. It's 137, I think, years old this year, and still finding its way along. But Fred, one of these older people, my mom was like this too, who could quote poetry from memory, and he would do that a lot. He had raucous jokes. He'd been in San Quentin for industrial sabotage. So we listened. We hung on every word that he said. But one day he was trying to convince me to do something that he wanted me to do, or to take a position that he thought it was important that I take. And he said, I learned this lesson from a Chartist. And Chartism was in the 1830s, and maybe the 1840s in Britain. And Fred grew up in the Canadian Maritimes, and he had somehow, he said when he was 10, sat at the foot of this guy who was maybe also 10 in the 1830s and had made his way to Newfoundland and was educating Fred. And it struck me at that moment that, you know, he was telling me in the 1980s a story that was 140, a word of mouth story that was 140 years old. I gave this talk in Eugene, Oregon not too long ago, and I'm not going to tell what he said to me here, but there was a woman afterwards who was just completely persistent and finally got me to tell the actual substance of the story. And she wrote it down and she said, you know, 50 years from now, I'm going to tell this to somebody, and then it'll be however old it will be. So, one more. This is, I ended up then teaching on a Mellon professorship back at Northwestern during the anti-apartheid movement. And this is a picture from the Shantytown protests. We said Shantytown, today we would say encampment. The encampment protests on the quad at the Crown Center at Northwestern. And it's Gene Allman, who used to also teach at Illinois, in the picture. But others in the picture are in the ball cap is Dennis Brutus, the great South African poet and leader of the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, who was out there all the time as a protester. He taught at Northwestern. But likewise in the picture are Penny Rosemont, the leader of the Chicago Surrealist group, and now important as Surrealism makes its kind of re-entry into the world, an important spokesperson for Surrealism. Her late husband, Franklin Rosemont, looking a little bit like Breton with sunglasses on. And then above Penny is Ted Jones, the fabulous Black Beat and Surrealist poet and jazz musician who was from Cairo. And so he and I really had a lot to bond around. But the Rosemonts and Ted, you know, they were exactly the kind of outsiders that universities want to keep up. Well, they don't want to allow encampments at all, but they were exactly the kind of outsiders that were warned against, and that Columbia invents all these technologies and police presences to keep off of its campus. So, and you know, there were 90 arrests in those protests, and there was plenty of repression always, but I've got to say that this feels a little bit different to me. So let's stop there and we can have some question and answer.